Cut off means let them be there. We're just not focusing on them. Let the mind, like a cloudless sky, be clear, empty, and evenly devoid of grasping, and settle it into utter vacuity. So vacuity here means this stillness. So when we simply know that we're aware, we are resting in the experience of awareness. What we notice, of course, is that experience of awareness is stillness. Awareness is completely still, open and spacious. And he says, by doing so, there arises the shamatha of joy, luminosity, and non-conceptuality. So this is something quite important here. There are three qualities of mind that really become very manifest at the time of shamatha. And the three qualities are clarity, non-conceptuality, bliss. And no matter what object we're using for shamatha practice, the more we go further into the practice, the more these three qualities will start to manifest. Sometimes our mind will seem very crystal clear. Other times it will be very non-conceptual. Of course, this means stillness. Other times our mind will seem to be very still. And other times our mind will be very blissful and joyful. And the meditation text, the shamatha texts, warn the meditator about these experiences for two reasons. One is that all these three experiences are very pleasant. So often what happens is when they first start to arise, we go, oh, that's nice, I like that. I want that. Mm-hmm. And we try and hold on to it. And of course, as soon as we try and hold on to it, immediately it's gone. And then what we do is we think, oh, that was really nice. Let's see if I can recreate that. So we put a lot of effort to try to recreate that. But of course, that effort of trying to recreate it is guaranteeing that it won't arise because we're having craving and attachment for it. So of course, when these experiences arise, if we end up with craving and attachment for them, our whole practice has come to a grinding halt. Meaning now instead of craving physical sense pleasures, now we're craving these experiences. We just shifted from craving that to craving this. So when these experiences arise, don't generate any craving, and rather use these experiences to understand that we're going in the right direction, and then use those very experiences to go deeper into the practice, because these are going to really help us to go much deeper into the practice. So that's one warning, not to get caught up in these with craving and attachment. The other warning in the meditation texts with these experiences, particularly this one, is to not misinterpret the experience. Because once we start having these experiences, particularly this stillness, it's very easy to misinterpret this as, I'm realizing the nature of the mind, I'm realizing emptiness. In fact, I think I'm close to enlightenment. A non-conceptual, still mind is not a realization of anything. It's just a still, non-conceptual mind. That's it. So therefore, not to misinterpret this as some profound insight into emptiness or nature of the mind. So therefore, these are the qualities he's mentioning here, is that the further we go into the practice, the more these will start to manifest, and not to get caught up with them or misinterpret them. Okay. So if we go back to the text, again, it says here, alternatively, just like the swordsman's battle with the archer taught in the Vinaya scriptures, having generated strong mindfulness and introspection, as soon as any thought arises, cut it off completely, not allowing it to continue. Meaning, if a thought arises, cut it off means don't pay any attention to it. We're just resting in awareness itself. And the analogy or example here, the swordsman's battle with the archer, is that in the Vinaya scriptures, the scriptures on ethics, there's a story about how this archer is trying to shoot with an arrow, bow and arrow, this swordsman. But the swordsman's very skillful, is that whenever an arrow comes, they just go flick, 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 and it doesn't penetrate. So that's what we are to do with these thoughts here, is just go flick, 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 and don't pay any attention to them. But I think in the example here, somehow the swordsmen get distracted and then... So of course, if we get distracted and caught up, then we're out of the practice. Okay. So these are the two practices mentioned here, the ones we did. The observing the mind, meaning we're focusing on the mental events. The resting in awareness is where more emphasis on just the awareness itself. If we go up then on top of page 5, it says, when the proliferation of thoughts has been finally severed and you are unwaveringly still, then without losing mindfulness or introspection, immediately loosen your concentration and relax into a state of meditative equipoise. And it's a quote here from Machik Labdron, the founder of the Chur practice, the Tibetan yogini, and she says, focus attentively and loosely relax. It is there that the mind can be settled. So what this is saying here is that we are to find this balance between being too tight and too loose. Because if we're too tight, we get agitated and distracted. If we're too loose, we fall into dullness. So we're trying to find that balance of being relaxed and alert at the same time. And that's what's being said here. We're trying to find that balance. Because initially, and we see this in the shamatha chart, we flip over to the shamatha chart, this windy road to shamatha, along the side of the road, down the bottom, we see this flame. That's the amount of effort we need to apply in mindfulness and introspection. And so at the beginning, of course, they're not very well developed, so we have to put a lot of effort to be mindful and with introspection. But as we move along the path, the flame gets smaller and smaller and smaller and completely disappears. And so that's what's being said here a little bit, is that as we move into the shamatha practice, we need to sort of relax a little bit more and less effort, because that effort could push us into being too tight and too agitated. But of course, if we relax too much, then we can fall into dullness. And there's another quote here from Saraha, great Mahasiddha from India, 8th century. He says, if you relax the mind that is bound by tightness, it will undoubtedly become free. And actually, I think it's from the same text. Saraha says the following. He says, and he's using the analogy of a camel. He says, when tied up, a camel tries to wander in all 10 directions. When freed, it stays immovable and firm. Meaning, if we're trying to restrain a camel and hold it still, it struggles to be free. But if we let go of that, it just stays quietly without struggling. And he says, it stays moving. I have come to understand the mind is like a stubborn camel. So of course, if we're bound up in tightness, if we're tight and tense, we're going to struggle and get agitated. And so then we need to release that to allow the mind to remain calm. So we need to find this balance here. It says, in this way, relax without becoming distracted. And so the next section here is also relating to this balancing, talking about balancing the mind. It says, if your focus is too tight and you think that excitement is arising, relax it a little. If your focus is too loose and you think that laxity is arising, tighten it a little. So this is what we can do in any of these shamatha practices, is that as a beginner, we tend to fall to either really into complete dullness or complete distraction. So what we can do is on each breath, we can balance. And a good way of doing that is combining with the out breath. When we're breathing out, that's a natural time to relax and release any tightness or tension. And the in-breath is a natural time to sharpen the focus. So by relaxing and releasing on the out-breath, we're overcoming tension, agitation, distraction, and then sharpening the focus on the in-breath helps us to overcome that dullness. So we can do this sort of balancing act on each breath, and then hopefully find that middle way between dullness and distraction. And then it says here, by finding a balance between the two, between dullness and distraction, the mind is drawn away from the movement of thoughts. However, it is necessary to be cautious of laxity whenever there is a factor of stillness. So again, generally, when we release that tension, the mind goes quiet, then there's a very much danger of that quiet, clear mind of just drifting into dullness. So we need to be aware of that. And that is actually also in the shamatha chart here. If we look at this shamatha chart again, the elephant is the mind. The fact that it is black is dullness. The monkey is conceptual thought in general. The fact that it's black is this excitement. So what we see here at the first stage of practice is that the elephant and monkey are running wildly ahead of us. Meaning that what we notice at the first stage of practice, what we really notice is that our mind is completely out of control. If we've never meditated, we can have this illusion that our mind is, sort of okay, I think I should be able to focus on the breath or whatever the object is. I think I should be able to do that okay. Okay, it might get a little bit dull and distracted, but that's not going to be too difficult, I think. And then, of course, when we sit down and we focus on the breath, and then usually after 2 or 3 seconds, woof, off we go. And we're gone for like minutes at a time. And then after some minutes, we go, oh, hang on, I'm supposed to be on the breath. We come back to the breath for another couple of seconds, and then off we go again. So when we have this experience, we often go, I just can't meditate. I just can't meditate. In fact, I must be doing something wrong, because my mind used to be sort of okay, but now since I've started meditating, it's completely out of control. So I must be doing something wrong. And then often what people do is if they're in a group situation, then they open their eyes a bit, look around, everyone's very still and upright. I'm the only one here who can't meditate. Everyone else is meditating. I'm just hopeless. I can't meditate. So, of course, if this is your experience, you can meditate. In fact, this is the very first sign of progress in the practice, is simply noticing how out of control and chaotic our mind really is. So actually you've made it to stage 1. Very good, you're making progress. The very first sign of progress is simply noticing how out of control and chaotic our mind really is. And so of course we need to put a lot of effort in mindfulness, because we're constantly distracted, constantly getting very drowsy and dull and nearly asleep. So we're constantly coming back, usually just for a few seconds and gone again for long periods of time. But then if we keep meditating, we go around to the second stage of practice, around the corner here, and now we see the elephant and monkey are not running so fast anymore, and they have a little bit of white on the top of their head. So at the second stage of practice, what we notice is that our mind is starting to settle down a little bit. The white is a little bit of stability and clarity coming into our meditation. So by the second stage of practice, now our mind is settling down a bit, and we're noticing periods in our meditation where it's really settling down a bit, and maybe we can focus on the object for up to a minute or two before we get distracted, but still we're distracted for long periods of time. So even at the second stage of practice, we're more away off the object than we are on the object. But then if we keep practicing, we'll go around to the third and fourth stage here. And this third and fourth stage, this road here, is called the road of mindfulness, the power of mindfulness. By the third and fourth stage, now our mindfulness is getting a lot better. So much so that by stage 3, we can now focus on the object longer, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, And now if we could become distracted, we quickly come back to the object. And that's symbolized by the elephant turning the head backwards. But now, here we see the rabbit has come into the picture. And we see the rabbit then at stage 3, 4 and 5, in the middling stages here. And that's rabbit is this subtle dullness, subtle laxity. And this is what's being referred to here in the text, where it says, however, it is necessary to be cautious of laxity when there is a factor of stillness. Again, when the mind now has become more still and quiet and focused, we need to be aware of this laxity, this subtle dullness. Because if we're not, we'll get stuck there. Because we'll think we're on the object, it's there, I'm focusing, I'm not really getting distracted much. I must be close to shamatha because I'm not really getting distracted. But what's missing is the quality of our attention, that we're sinking into this subtle dullness, meaning we're on the object, but it's not very sharp and clear. And so that's what's being said here, that we need to notice that when our mind is becoming more still and focused on the object, to start to notice this, to sharpen the attention. And here we have a quote from a great Mahamudra practitioner, Master Chandra Goleman, who says, "If I rely upon exertion, excitement will arise. And if I give it up, laxity will occur. Since it is difficult to find an appropriate balance, what use is there in stirring up my mind?" So therefore, what we're saying here is, as we go into the practice, we're cultivating that finer and finer balance between agitation, distraction and dullness. At the initial stage, of course, the first few stages, we either get completely distracted or really nearly falling asleep. But as we start through these middling stages of shamatha, which is being described here in the text, the mind starts to settle down, then we start to be more and more on the object, but now we need to start to fine-tune that balance, to notice more and more subtle degrees of agitation, subtle degrees of dullness. And often here, the analogy given in the text, meditation text, is the analogy of a guitar string. If a guitar string is too tight or too loose, it doesn't play well. Likewise, if our mind is too tight or too loose, it doesn't focus well. And that's what Chandra Goleman is talking about here, that we're constantly fine-tuning the pitch of our focus. Too tight, agitation. Too loose, dullness. So we're constantly fine-tuning this. And this is only something that we can better fine-tune through experience. That the deeper we get into it, the more we can fine-tune this and find really that very good balance between the dullness and distraction. So this is what's being talked about here. Any questions so far? Okay, so if we continue in the text, it says, "Whatever thoughts arise, when you observe their nature, they vanish, and a pure vacuity dawns." Similarly, if you also investigate when the mind is still, there is an unobscured, clear vacuity and vivid clarity. Seeing that there is no difference between the two, is well known to great meditators as the fusion of stillness and movement. So what this is saying is, again, if we can simply observe thoughts when they arise, without getting caught up in them, without grasping them, then immediately they'll vanish. Because we're not feeding them. And of course, when they vanish, where they were is the mind, the space of the mind. And that space of the mind, of course, is stillness. And similarly, when we look at when the mind is still, we see the same experience. We see that same experience of, here it says, clear vacuity and vivid clarity. So this vacuity just means absence, a space, a clear space that is very clear. So again, we'll start to have that clarity, and that space is stillness. And also we'll start to notice this experience becoming very joyful and blissful. And so this is what fusion of stillness and movement is to really see that the mind and the thoughts that appear in the mind, they're not two different things. That the mind, the thoughts and so forth, are also clarity and awareness. And it says here, or alternatively, using the following method, use the following method for sustaining the stillness of mind. No matter what kind of thoughts arise, without stopping them, recognize when they move and when they move and where they move. And by doing, observe and settle in the nature of those thoughts. So here, what it's saying is that when thoughts arise, we don't need to stop them or block them. We just notice that they're coming from that space of the mind, and we see them resting or moving within the space of the mind, and then they disappear back into that space of the mind. And it says here, by settling in this way, movement will eventually cease and there will be stillness. Meaning, again, if we can simply observe these thoughts and other mental events, we're not feeding them. Which means the habit of them coming up will get less and less and less. And here, in this practice, we have a certain model that we use to notice progress in our practice. In shamatha practice, the standard model that you are often presented in terms of the stages of progress is this 9-stage model here in this diagram, called the 9 mental abidings. Meaning we are, in each stage, we are abiding better and better on the object. So this is usually the model presented, particularly in conjunction with the breath practice, to see the stages we go through when we're focusing on the breath. That first we're completely distracted from the breath, then we start to be able to focus a bit better. Third stage, we can mostly hold on the breath, a little bit distracted. The fourth stage, we can be on the breath the whole time. And then these middling stages here, where we're better and better quality of attention and so forth. So this is the normal model that you see in the stages of progress in the shamatha practice. But here, in this shamatha practice in Mahamudra, where we're observing the mind, then the model we often see is this model here talking about stillness. Stillness and movement. And the model that we usually see is and this usually is a 4-stage model. So remember, these are a model to describe the stages we go through in the shamatha practice, particularly when we're using the mind as the object. And the first stage of progress, so remember in the 9-stage model, the first stage of progress, we're just completely distracted all the time. So here, in the observing the mind, what we notice at the first stage of practice our experience is that simply there's a waterfall of thoughts crashing down, non-stop, one after the other. That's our experience, that there's one after the other, constant. And then if we watch that, as it's saying in the text here, then if we watch that waterfall of thoughts, we're not feeding it. Which means that the amount of thoughts crashing down will settle down a little bit. So at the second stage, what we're going to notice is instead of a waterfall of thoughts crashing down, that it'll be more like a fast-flowing river of thoughts. So still quite a lot of thoughts, but not so intense as before. A little bit slow, but still quite a lot of thoughts. And here also not so much gap between when one thought finishes and the next thought starts, but not as frenetic as here because we're not feeding it. And if we keep watching those thoughts, the amount of thoughts will slow down. And at the next stage of practice, it'll be more like a slow-moving river. And what we're going to start to notice here is that the gap between when one thought finishes and the next thought starts will start to get bigger. So it means that more and more stillness, less and less movement. Here it's just 100% movement. Here, a little bit of stillness coming in, but mainly movement. Here, more stillness, less movement. And then lastly, as the text is suggesting here, this will empty into a still lake. That our mind will become still. And this is what's being said here in the text. That there will be this, if we watch that movement, it says, by settling in this way, movement will eventually cease and there will be stillness. So this is really describing the stages that we go through in the shamatha practice, observing the mind. And so this is often the model that is presented for that.
In the breathing, it's not breathing?
This makes more sense with respect to the mind because we're observing thoughts. So that's part of the object. Whereas this model probably doesn't make so much sense with the breath because yes, there's lots of thoughts, but that's when we're watching the mind. So therefore, you could use that, but it would make more sense to use this model because this is talking about better and better on the object and talking about how much we're distracted, whereas this is really talking about how things are unfolding in the mind. So it makes it more relevant, more appropriate. I mean, you could use that for the mind, and sometimes you see that, but more commonly in the Mahamudra tradition, when they describe the stages of progress in shamatha using the mind, you'll see this model presented more commonly. Okay. Okay, and then he goes on in the text, it says, it is similar to the analogy of releasing a bird that has been held for a long time on a ship in the midst of a great ocean. Sustain this state in accordance with that said in a doha. So remember the doha were these songs of realization that literally the master would sing to the disciple as like a pointing out instruction. And here it says, it is similar to how a raven released from its ship circles in all directions and then settles back there again. So in centuries past, of course, when they were going out on an ocean and they're looking for land somewhere, they often had a bird or some birds on the boat, and of course they couldn't see very far, and so to know if there's any land in any direction, they would release a bird and then watch what it does. Because a bird, if there's a land in the distance, the bird will fly off that way. So then they would follow the bird that way. But of course, if there's no land, the bird would take off and circle a little bit, and then there's nowhere to land, it comes back to the boat. So likewise, the analogy here is that these thoughts are like the bird released from the boat. That a thought is released from the mind, it comes up in the mind, it circles a little bit, and then it settles back into the mind. Meaning, what we notice in this practice is we observe the thought arising in the mind, and then slowly disappearing back into the mind. So this is the analogy used for that here.
Two questions. One is, what you described before, that when we realize that or see that the moving mind, the thoughts and the stillness is from the same nature, is it not already vipassana? And second question...
So I'll answer that first. So remember, this definition here, clear and known, when we talk about nature of the mind, we can talk about two levels.
This is the gross mind.
We can talk about conventional nature of the mind, ultimate nature of the mind. So usually, you know, in the context of Dzogchen or Mahamudra, when you hear nature of mind, implicit in that is we're really talking about this. We're really talking about ultimate nature of mind, most often. So of course, nature of mind, ultimate nature of mind is, of course, is emptiness. Because ultimate nature of the mind is how does the mind exist?